Welcome to Sober.Coffee, a weekly coffee chat sharing experience, strength, and hope for anyone on the sober road to recovery. You can download Sober.Coffee weekly on all podcast platforms and check us out on Instagram at Sober.Coffee Podcast and on Twitter at Sober.Coffee Pod. To learn more about us and to help support these sessions, visit online at Sober.Coffee. Here are your hosts, two guys on their own path to recovery, Mike and Glenn. Let's join them at the coffee shop.
Mike and Glenn, which one am I?
You are Mike again. You keep asking me that question.
How do we know that? Because we're not
because you have a
video.
name in your mom put your name in your jacket.
You know what we should have?
What, your mom on?
A YouTube channel.
Oh,
That way people could see
let's
us.
work
we could
on
go.
it.
We could go 3-dimensional.
Let's work on that
Yeah. All right.
someday.
Hey, super excited about today.
I know, man. We have a table for three. Love table for threes.
Table for
Really
three.
excited about the one today.
Yeah. So this is this is part of our attempt to be open-minded.
Be inclusive.
Be inclusive. We, Glenn and I share a very similar story. We were a train wreck, and then we found hope in the rooms and program of Alcoholics Anonymous. So
That's the 12-step program.
12-step program. Right. So everyone knows that who listens to the show, but for those that are just joining us at the coffee shop for the first time, it needs to be known that we don't think we have the only answer. This is the only answer that's worked for us.
Well, it's amazing. I'm out there on multiple social media sites.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I kind of do our social media attempts, right?
Right.
And I have a Twitter account that's focused on sobriety, and I am amazed. People that are supposed to be out there enjoying sobriety, I am amazed at how they just stab each other, not in the back, right in each other's chest.
Right. You can do that when you're hiding behind a @ symbol.
Oh, absolutely. And they sit there and stab each other about, oh, my program's better than your program, and your program sucks, and I tried your program, your program blows. And I'm like, what are you doing?
Right.
I'm just so confused. So, you know what? Our podcast, and then we'll introduce Serge. Our podcast is sobriety focused.
That's right.
Now, when we tell our stories, you got sober in AA. I got sober in AA.
Right.
Right. And I still work
That's
at AA.
all I got to share.
And I saw you in a meeting recently, so I know you do too.
Right.
But that's just our story. That's our experience.
Right.
They are not exclusive experiences.
Right.
That is not the only solution out there. And I'm embracing the stories that I hear of people getting sober out there and changing their lives any way they want, right? All I know is what works for me and what didn't work for me.
Right. But what we want to do is at least open up the door and
Totally.
say, look, there are alternatives out there. If AA is not your thing, don't give up on sobriety. I'm telling you, the life on this side of drugs and alcohol is just, it's a reward.
So something hit me this past week, and, I have never met anybody who regretted getting sober.
Right.
Not one person. Right. I met people who regretted going back out and relapsing,
Right.
but never one person who regretted getting sober.
Right.
That's got to say something.
Yep. So this morning we've got an author. So we need an author series as well, and his name is Serge, and he wrote a book.
I need to behave.
Yes, I know, right? Oh, and when I emailed him, I'm like, oh man, I got to make sure my periods are in the
use
right
the word
place.
sir?
And yeah, right.
That's awesome.
But author of a mindful program for lasting change, the proactive 12 steps. Serge, welcome to the coffee shop.
Serge, welcome.
And Mike and Glenn, I'm happy to be with you guys.
Yeah, great to have you.
Yeah. So I will full transparency. We reached out, I guess, maybe through social media or whatever. I don't know how we connected, but the short and skinny is, if I'm going to have an author on the program, then I like to read the book, right? And so full transparency, I've read the book, the Proactive 12 Steps. I agree with some of it, and I disagreed with some of it. And that's okay because I agree with the program I'm working. Some of the program I agree with, some of the program I don't agree with, but I work it, right? So, Serge, you are a therapist by trade, and so tell me a little bit about your journey of why you wrote the book.
Well, I discovered the 12 steps at least 20 years ago through some friends who were in a program. And I was really fascinated by how powerful programs are and how people benefit from them. And it's very different from what it's like when you're a therapist. When you're a therapist, you don't think about one size fits all. You kind of try to focus on one person, and you don't really have kind of a general philosophy of how people change, because everybody's different. And so I was really fascinated by what made this program so useful for people who were really in very dire circumstances. Mm-hmm. And so over the years, I've had a dialogue with this. This is the 6th edition of the process. Mm. So I've had a long dialogue, and over the years kind of it has enriched my practice and my knowledge of what I do. And I think I have enriched what I've done through, this dialogue with the steps of trying to understand the process and cross-fertilize what it brings and what my understanding of therapy, and especially trauma-informed therapy. Mm.
Right. So quick question. One, and from an informational perspective, are you on the sober path yourself? And secondly, are your patients, do you typically find them on the sober path?
So, in a strictly speaking way, I'm not on the sober path in the sense that I don't have an addiction that corresponds to the AA type programs. Mm-hmm. However, my perspective on it is that we are all on a path of dealing with trauma. Mm-hmm. And I use trauma in a very different way than, say, it's used in a medical way, or maybe that some therapists use it. Trauma usually implies some kind of a big shock, like a car crash, and people who are all mangled and, emergency, and so trauma first came to therapy after the Vietnam War by saying people can be really damaged emotionally, mentally, the same way as they are damaged physically. Mm-hmm. But the therapists who have been working with trauma have actually come to a different understanding that trauma is not just the big stuff, but just about anything that happens to us that we're not able to fully digest at the time is something that leaves, it leaves residuals. And those residuals, because we cannot digest them, are not conscious. They're beyond words. Mm-hmm. Okay. Mm-hmm. And so we all have some stuff like this, and we all have coping mechanisms to deal with it. And so from that perspective, for some people, the coping mechanism of choice, or, unfortunately that happens, might be alcohol. It
sure.
might be drugs.
That was my choice. Right.
Yeah. But, essentially what it is we're all in that same ballpark. Mm-hmm. And so that's kind of my approach to it.
Yeah, so I can really relate to that. And to put it in my own words, I personally didn't have some big traumatic event. But the way you described it, I really relate to is I went through things in my life that I couldn't digest and I couldn't process, right? So I call that weight, right? And emotional weight, right? And it would piling up and piling up and piling up. And it wasn't one major big boulder. It was 5,000 small ones or 500 medium-sized ones that just got me down. And then I had to escape.
Yeah.
And I found alcohol as a great escape button. Mm-hmm. And that was for whatever period of time. And hey, when I started out, alcohol was fun. Mm-hmm. It was a great escape. It was a party until I crossed that line and I couldn't go back over it. And then I was hooked, and then I had to have that next drink.
Right.
So I really like how you put that, Serge.
Yeah, and I like the fact that in the book and in our conversation here, it's the root cause, right? Oftentimes I've heard in recovery, and I've used the line myself, I don't have a drinking problem, I have a thinking problem, right? So, this trauma, this concept of this inherent trauma, to some people, it was a comment that that a father made when they were 5 years old. To other people, it was abuse. To other people, it was loss of a family member. But this trauma, that trauma follows you, at least that's why I'm hearing it, follows you long, and then you're going to pick a coping skill. You're either going to, and again, I'm no therapist, you are, but you're either going to bury it, you're going to deal with it, you're going to drink over it, you're going to drug over it, you're going to buy over it, you're going to eat over it, you're going to, whatever it takes, you're going to do something to combat that trauma.
And I want to go back to something, Mike, that Glenn said about the death by 1,000 cuts, or the weight coming from there. It's not, the whole thing about it is, that's the kind of stuff that you look at it and you say, I shouldn't be affected by it. It can't be trauma because it's not such a big deal. Mm-hmm. But really, you're talking about something that can be as subtle as, having difficulty in interpersonal communications. And the difficulty might come from the sense of your struggle between being accepted, mm-hmm. And feeling shame, mm-hmm. Not being very comfortable with who you are, or feeling that people, reject who you are, or the society you live in doesn't value, all of these little things that, are not, you cannot put in some kind of a big, umbrella to say, oh, this major thing happened to me, mm-hmm. but it affects you day in and day out. Mm-hmm. And because it affects you day in and day out, it's kind of, you take, you're shaped by that. You mm-hmm. become avoidant. You look for relief somewhere else,
Right. So back to the book then, as it lays out a proactive 12 steps, if you will, to dealing with that trauma, getting healthy. But I'm going to go right to the sensitive point here. I'm just going to get right to the meat here. You do it with the proactive 12 steps does not take a spiritual / I think you use the word religion in your book more than spirituality. It doesn't take that. It doesn't take that approach. It takes a different path. Can you talk about that? Because
Mike, great. Let's just jump into it.
Yeah,
it's 12 steps without God. So that's very, and I want to, I'm very happy to talk about it from the place of, this is not about, there is one camp that says here's with God and here's without God and clash. And
I picked that up.
My solution is better than yours.
Right. I picked that up with yours. Yours seemed to include, if so be that was your source, I didn't read in there that was the wrong choice, Yeah,
not at all. Not at all. I have a tremendous respect for people who believe in God, and I think it motivates people and it gives us strength that in some way you could say part of the writing it is to say, how can we get some of that juice, for people who don't believe in God? Mm-hmm. And you can't force yourself to believe, just like, so how do you do that? And so that is about, let's see what it is that's in us human beings that gives us that resilience, that capacity for doing something that seems impossible, for creating miracles. And if you're religious, you're going to say, this is how God made us. Mm-hmm. But even if you're not religious, you're going to say, well, if God made us this way, then it's a human trait. Mm-hmm. And then, the same way as, you could say God made us who we are. But you're going to study medicine in order to help God heal you. Mm-hmm. It helps to understand the mechanism by which human beings are healed.
Right.
And so if you put it within the context of, all of this happens ultimately by the grace of God, no problem. But as you understand better the mechanism by which you're healed, then you can help yourself and you can help God heal you. And that was my intention to do that, mm-hmm. So that it creates a path that is visible to all.
Mm-hmm. And I love that because, and I'll let Glenn jump in here, but what I love about it is I'm certain that we have people in their journey. I had a different journey. I had this spiritual connection coming into the program of Alcoholics Anonymous, so it was very easy for me to bake right into the rhetoric. But the application, but the reality is that a lot of people aren't at that spot, and the reason you're here today is because if they're not here today, but they need hope, they need help, they need a place to turn, and so Glenn.
Yeah. So for me, I grew up in a religious family, religious house, in a home. When I started to get sober, and I walked in the rooms of AA, and Serge, I worked the AA program for 10 years, half-ass, and I got the results. It was just what detox am I going to next? What hospital? It was only in 2014 that I surrendered, and I literally surrendered to my therapist, to my counselor, and I said, dude, I will do whatever you tell me to do. I just cannot take another drink. And I literally did exactly what he told me to do, and I still surrendered to him today. But as I walked into AA, right, and I was familiar with AA, but now that I'm surrendering, I'm actually working the steps. Step 2 talks about a higher power. It doesn't mention God. It talks about a higher power. Well, for me, my higher power at that time was my sponsor. My higher power was my counselor therapist. My higher power were people in the room that I had relationships with that didn't have to drink yesterday. And they were my higher power for a long period of time, because the God that I grew up with didn't work. It was a bunch of man-made crap that just didn't work for me. And
so it was a deterrent rather than anything.
Yeah. I mean, I was like, but I hung out and I was starting to rebuild a really cool life using those higher powers, those human higher powers. And the way I define a higher power is anything outside of my head, because I had a lot of crap going on in my head. And, I like to say, hey, it's hard to fix a problem with the same brain that created it. So I needed that outside influence. I needed the input and perspective from my counselor and from my sponsor and from guys in the room who I trusted.
Yeah.
And so, over time, if you want to learn how to swim, you got to get in the pool. Nobody ever learned how to swim in a seminar. You got to get in the pool. So I got in different spiritual pools, not religious pools, spiritual pools, and I started learning. But I had to start with unlearning a lot of that crap I grew up with. And I learned different ways of looking at higher power, who today I call God. But, that's my path. There's people who I know are very successful in sobriety, and they don't have a relationship with my God.
Right.
I think a higher power just needs to be somebody outside of me.
Right. Well, and if I could, and Serge, I'm going to steal a little bit of your thunder, but step 2 in Alcoholics Anonymous says, came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. I'm reading from Serge's book. Step 2 for the proactive says that I understand that I cannot force change through willpower. I need to disentangle my life patiently. And, again, I'm just trying to give the listeners a bent that there's a step that you could take, that, because exactly what Glenn was saying, he had to unlearn, he had to untangle. And
I know, I love the word untangle. That's exactly what I had
fantastic?
I had to untangle, a lot of
so
stuff.
I'm sorry, Serge, I didn't mean to interrupt. Go ahead.
No. So I'm glad you read this. And so I think, what you said and what Glenn said, I think the growth and recovery are unlearning, at least as much as learning, because until you unlearn, you cannot learn something new. You're encumbered by your preconceived notions. And it takes banging your head against a wall until you finally realize you're not going to go anywhere there until you actually unlearn. And that's where that image of disentangling is, that you cannot do it you have to shift gears. You cannot do it in an impatient way. You cannot push and pull, but you have to actually go very slowly. And that's what this process is. And I want to relate this to the notion of God as well. Because I think if you put yourself in a place of when the program started, the promise of the programs was nothing short of miraculous. So why would people believe two drunks when they said they had found a solution? and you needed God in a way to justify, to say, you may not believe in us, but you believe, you've heard about the notion of grace of God, so that gives you permission to try this. But now you have millions of people who have tried this, and so actually the entry point is, whatever your belief system, you have to see the reality that millions of people have succeeded through this. Why don't you give it a try?
Right. Fact and faith. Right.
Yeah. So the one thing I pulled out, and I'll just give you a little background, of how I look at things. But, when I use the word surrender, right, that means we have this book, the AA Big Book, right? And I believe the words in the AA Big Book. And, and this is just my perspective, when I surrendered to the words in that AA Big Book, and the reason why I do is because I need something outside of my own head. My game stopped working. My shtick stopped working. And I had to latch on to something else. So I see people in the rooms who, will go in a meeting when reading from the big book, and they actually go and they try to change the words, right? And I watch them, and they change the words to fit how it serves them at their particular time with what they're trying to do at that particular time. And the way I look at that is they're trying to game the system, right? And instead of saying, well, here's 12 steps. Well, no, I think they should be 4 steps. Or, I just see people make all kinds of crap, and it hurts them. It hurts their progress. It hurts their, go forward. It hurts their growth, to use a word that you use that I love. So on page 71, I read, quote unquote, I started rewriting the 12 steps. And that's the first thing I thought of is I try to surrender. And if the book tells me to do something and I don't like it, I still do it. And because typically when I don't like it and I don't want to follow it, it's because I've got an ulterior motive that I'm trying to get around.
Right.
And I'm trying to serve myself instead of surrendering and doing the next right thing. So for me, I made a decision to surrender to that big book, every word in that big book. Right. And like there's a chapter called There Is a Solution. It doesn't say there might be a solution. It doesn't say there could be. It doesn't say for the chosen few. It says there is a solution. And in the promises, it says these promises, and there's some pretty amazing things outlined in the 9-step promises. It says they will always materialize. At the time when I came in, I couldn't even lift my head off the table, Serge. I can't tell you how bad I was. I mean, when I finally surrendered, I was in 6 hospitals across the country, 8-day detox. I laid up on my counselor's floor at 2:00 on a Friday afternoon, and I surrendered. I'm like, dude, I will do anything you tell me to do, right? But all that stuff that was going on, I mean, the promises says they will always materialize. Now it says sometimes quickly, sometimes slowly, and I'll underline the slow with what you said. I'll underline that because I'm on the slow train, but that gives me the patience, right?
Yeah.
And I believe those words.
Glenn, I totally respect the idea of the 12 steps and of following them. And I think there is a lot of value in something that has, gone on through, it has the test of time. So I want to be very clear that, my concept of rewriting the steps is not a question of replacing the steps, but is a question of giving a different lighting, a different perspective on it. Okay. And so it is, and it's not something that says, I'm paraphrasing the steps and writing a different language, but I'm saying I've had a dialogue with the steps from the perspective of a therapist who's informed by the notion of trauma. And so I'm inviting you to take a look at the steps from that perspective.
Yeah, I love that.
You're going to continue to go to the 12 steps, and it's going to continue the groups, and the fellowship is going to continue to be your primary, basically the place where you face reality, and the place where you have the support group of people who are going to carry you, because the change that happens is not through words, but it's through the connection with a group.
Mm-hmm.
And nobody has ever healed from reading a book. So the point there is that's going to give you another resource to look at things and ask yourself questions. And sometimes when we have words that are very familiar, we tend to repeat them without really understanding them.
I love
because
that.
Then we,
You know what? Can you say that again? I think that needs to be underlined, because that is, I get caught up in that.
Yeah. When we repeat words and they become second nature, we don't really listen to them.
Mm-hmm.
It becomes kind of a background noise.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not even putting that down, because there's something very powerful when people together in a room recite words that have, that become so familiar. It's also something that creates that sense of community. And that sense of community and that sense of it's been there around for a long time. There's a lot of healing power that comes from it. Okay, so I'm not putting it down, but there is a loss in doing it, that you no longer pay attention to what the words mean.
Well, you know, it's like in some churches, and I'm not gonna, some churches you recite prayers and you have no idea what you're saying, because you recited them for 40 years and you have no idea, you know. I really relate to that.
Yeah, if I could, I'll tell you what I love about what's happened, and I wish we had more time. I really do, because I love your insight. I appreciate the book, and the reason I appreciate it, and you just used the word community, and I think we're all in this community of trying to help people get sober, right, and live a better life, right. And what I find very appealing about the Proactive book is that for those people that are joining in the coffee shop and they just can't get past the spirituality piece, there are other alternatives. And I just think we need to be open to point them in the right direction. And I think that this would be a good first step for somebody who's struggling with their spirituality. Give the Proactive 12 Steps a look and make your own call.
So, Serge, where can they find the Proactive 12 Steps? Do you have a website? I know the book's on Amazon.
So they can find it on Amazon, on Barnes & Noble online. But also I put it on a website, proactive12steps.com, so that people can find the wording of the steps and a commentary without having to buy the book. So the book has more material, but, again, you can certainly give it a try, do a search for Proactive 12 Steps.
That's great. I want to follow your progress along. Now, when was this first published? You said you're on the 6th.
So it was about 20 years ago that I had the first edition, and then I've revised it over time. Okay. And so this came out last year.
Okay. Well, like I said, it
really
was
great.
And the one thing I'll recommend to people is, you recommended at the beginning of the book, don't speed read it. I sped read it, but you were cautious to say, take your time, because this is about self-examination. It's about self-understanding, self-awareness. And so I would just, I'd encourage people, if they're looking for an alternative, take a look at the Proactive 12 Steps. Serge, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, that's great. Serge, very nice to meet you. Thank you very much.
I enjoyed this conversation very much.
Yeah, thank you very much.
I wish we had more time. Have a great day, man.
You too.
All right, thanks, Serge. All right, bye-bye.
Thanks for joining us for today's coffee chat. To contact the show, email us at podcast@Sober.Coffee. If you need immediate help, the AA hotline is 800-839-1686. The National Suicide Prevention Hotline is 800-273-8255. Remember, Mike and Glenn are sharing their own journey on the path to recovery. Any suggestions, medical or otherwise, are their own experiences and should not be viewed as professional advice. See you next week, and remember, there is a solution.
Stay safe in the city of Chicago.